Hello students, today we are going to start chapter 11, that is transport in plants. Dear students, we all know that animals, they have a well-developed circulatory system for the transportation of materials. Do plants, they have a well-developed circulatory system for the transportation of materials? No. But still plants very well do the transportation of materials from one part to another part. For example, plants, they are absorbing water and minerals through their roots, and these water and minerals that is transported from lower part of the plant body to the upper part. Similarly, food that is synthesized in the leaves, and this food that is translocated to all parts of the plant body. So plants, they are also doing transportation of materials, but this transportation of materials that is taking place in a different way. And the materials which are transported within the plant body, they are also different, like water, minerals and organic solute that is transported from one part to another part. So students, in today's lecture, we are going to study the various types of transport mechanisms which are operating within the plant body. And these transport mechanisms, they are of two types, active transport and passive transport. So our today's topic is passive and active transport. So students, let's start it.
Dear students, there are two means of transport. First is passive transport and second is active transport. In case of passive transport, the molecules move from its higher concentration to lower concentration. Whereas in case of active transport, the molecules move from its lower concentration to higher concentration. Passive transport includes diffusion and facilitated diffusion. Now students, passive transport is also defined as the movement of molecules down a concentration gradient. Now what is concentration gradient? Concentration gradient is the difference in the concentration of molecules along the two sides of the membrane. So when the molecules, they are moving from high concentration to low concentration, it is known as movement down a concentration gradient. And when the molecules, they move from low concentration to high concentration, then this type of movement is known as against a concentration gradient. So in case of passive transport, the molecules move down a concentration gradient, whereas in case of active transport, the molecules move against a concentration gradient. Now students, passive transport includes diffusion and facilitated diffusion. Now what is diffusion? Let us try to understand it with the help of a simple experiment. Students, if we put a water-soluble dye into a beaker filled with water, then what will happen? The dye, it will dissolve in water, and the color of the dye, it will spread throughout the water. So this movement of the molecules of dye from the area of its high concentration to low concentration is known as diffusion. So the diffusion is defined as the movement of molecules, be it a solid, liquid or gas, from the region of its higher concentration to the region of its lower concentration. And the process of diffusion, that is due to the inherent kinetic energy which is present within these molecules. But a more meaningful definition of diffusion, that is in terms of chemical potential. Now what is chemical potential? Chemical potential is the amount of free energy per gram molecular weight of a substance. So diffusion in terms of chemical potential is defined as the net movement of a substance from an area of its high chemical potential into an area of its low chemical potential as a result of random, translational, kinetic motion of molecules, ions or atoms. So this is the definition of diffusion in terms of chemical potential, which is the amount of free energy per gram molecular weight of a substance, and free energy is that energy with which a molecule it performs work. So the movement of molecules from the region of its higher concentration to the region of lower concentration until the molecules they get uniformly distributed is known as diffusion. Now, what is diffusion pressure? Diffusion pressure is the pressure exerted by the diffusing particles. So when the particles they are moving from high concentration to lower concentration, then they are exerting a pressure on the molecules which are present nearby them. So this pressure exerted by the diffusing particles is known as diffusion pressure. Diffusion pressure is directly proportional to the concentration of diffusing particles. So if there is more concentration of diffusing particles, naturally the diffusion pressure it will be higher. And when the concentration of diffusing particles is low, the diffusion pressure it will also be low. Now, what are the various factors which affect the diffusion? The first factor is the temperature. An increase in temperature increases the rate of diffusion. It means the rate of diffusion is directly proportional to temperature. When we are rising the temperature or when we are increasing the temperature, the rate of diffusion also increases. This is because the temperature it increases the kinetic energy of the molecules. So when the kinetic energy of the molecules it increases, the molecules they move faster and hence the rate of diffusion also increases. Second is the density of the diffusing substance. The rate of diffusion is inversely proportional to the square root of the density of the diffusing substance. Dear students, this is also known as Gram's law. It means the rate of diffusion it will decrease if the density of the diffusing substance it increases. It means if a molecule is more denser or if it is more concentrated, then naturally the rate of diffusion will be slow in that case. And if a molecule is less dense or it is dilute, then in that case the rate of diffusion it will be faster. So this is the Gram's law. Gram's law states that the rate of diffusion it is inversely proportional to the square root of the density of the diffusing substance. So here we can see in the figure that when we are increasing the temperature, the rate of diffusion it also increases. So this is the beaker which is filled with water and the water that is having a temperature of 5 degrees Celsius. So here the molecules they are diffusing very slow, but when we are increasing the temperature from 5 degrees Celsius to 30 degrees Celsius, then we can see that the molecules of the dye they are diffusing faster, hence the rate of diffusion it also increases. It means if we are rising the temperature, if we are increasing the temperature, the rate of diffusion it also increases. Now the third factor is the medium in which the diffusion occurs. Rate of diffusion is slow if the medium is more concentrated. And this is the reason that a gas diffuses more rapidly through a vacuum than the air. It means the rate of diffusion that is faster in vacuum, then air, and then in the liquid medium. So if the density of the medium it increases, the rate of diffusion it will slow down. Fourth factor is diffusion pressure gradient. Diffusion pressure gradient is the difference in the diffusion pressure along the two sides of the membrane. So if the difference of the diffusion pressure along the two sides of the membrane is greater, then faster will be the rate of diffusion. And if the diffusion pressure gradient is low, then slower will be the rate of diffusion. So these are the four factors which are affecting the rate of diffusion. Now, what is the significance of diffusion? Diffusion is an essential process in exchanging of gases during respiration and photosynthesis. We all know that respiration and photosynthesis, which is the exchange of oxygen and CO2 gas, is taking place by the process of diffusion. So diffusion plays a very important role at the time of exchange of gases during respiration and photosynthesis. The uptake of mineral ions and the absorption of water, that is also because of the process of diffusion. When the concentration of mineral ions, that is more in the soil and it is lesser within the roots, then naturally the mineral ions, they will move from the region of its higher concentration, that is from the soil into the roots. So in this way, the uptake of minerals or the absorption of minerals and water take place. Diffusion, it also helps in the removal of excess water by the process of transpiration. We all know that transpiration is the removal of excess water which is absorbed by the plants in the form of water vapor. So this loss of water or excess water which is absorbed by the plants, that is also taking place by the process of diffusion. So students, this was all about diffusion. The next topic is facilitated diffusion. Now students, facilitated diffusion, it is also a type of passive transport. Means here also the molecules, they are moving from higher concentration to lower concentration. But the facilitated diffusion, that is facilitated or it is helped by transport proteins which are present across the membrane. So facilitated diffusion, it is a kind of passive transport in which the molecules move across the membrane with the help of transport proteins down the concentration gradient. So here also the molecules, they are moving down the concentration gradient, that is from higher concentration to lower concentration. Now students, facilitated diffusion, it takes place with the help of transport proteins, and these transport proteins, they are of two types. One are channel proteins or protein channels and the second are the carrier proteins. So we can see in the figure that in case of facilitated diffusion, the molecules, they are moving from higher to lower concentration, but their movement is not taking place through general surface of the cell membrane, but it is only taking place through the transport proteins which are present across the membrane. And these transport proteins, they are of two types. One are protein channels or channel proteins and the second are the carrier proteins. Now how the movement of materials, that is taking place through channel proteins. The channel proteins, they are having channels within themselves, and these channels which are present within these channel proteins, they are hydrophilic and they help in the diffusion of charged particles like calcium ions, sodium ions, potassium ions across the cell membrane. So through these channels, the charged particles, they are moving across the membrane or they are crossing the membrane and they are moving inside and or outside the cell. Second are the carrier proteins. Carrier proteins, they are also a type of transport proteins which are helping in the process of facilitated diffusion. Carrier proteins, they first binds to the molecule which is to be transported within the cell. And once the carrier protein, they binds with the molecule, then the carrier protein, it will undergo a conformational change or a change in its shape, and in this way the transport of materials will take place within the cell. So students, this was all about facilitated diffusion. Sometimes in facilitated diffusion, two different types of molecules move across the membrane. So it is of three different types depending upon the movement of molecules across the membrane. First is uniport, when a molecule move across a membrane independent of other molecule. Then it is known as uniport. When both molecules cross the membrane in the same direction, it is known as symport. And when both molecules cross the membrane in opposite direction, it is known as antiport. So this is the uniport. In case of uniport, we can see that the movement of one type of molecule, that is independent of the other. In case of symport, two types of molecules, they are moving together Whereas in case of antipode, when one molecule is moving inside, the other molecule that is moving outside. So students, this was all about facilitated diffusion.
So students, this was all about passive transport. In passive transport, the materials, they are moving down the concentration gradient. Passive transport includes diffusion and facilitated diffusion. Diffusion is taking place through general surface of the cell membrane, whereas facilitated diffusion is taking place through channel proteins and carrier proteins. Students, we all know that cell membrane, it is made up of lipids, and only hydrophobic substances, they can cross this cell membrane. Then what about hydrophilic substances? How these hydrophilic substances, they are entering or leaving the cell? Students, these hydrophilic substances, they are entering and leaving the cells through the channel proteins or the carrier proteins. So students, this was all about passive transport. Now there is one question. Is diffusion is the only way of transportation of materials in and out the cell? No. If diffusion is the only way of transportation of materials, then anything which is accumulated outside, whether it is useful or harmful, it will start entering into the cell. And once the concentration of these materials, it gets accumulated, they will start diffusing out the cell. Now, the cell membrane, it is having a very good control over the entry or exit of the materials. Sometimes the materials, they are entering or leaving the cells against the concentration gradient. So this movement of materials from its lower concentration to higher concentration is known as active transport. So students, let's start active transport.
So students, what is active transport? Active transport is the movement of all types of molecules across the cell membrane against the concentration gradient. That is from the area of lower concentration to the area of higher concentration. As the molecules, they are moving against the concentration gradient in case of active transport, therefore energy is involved in the form of ATP. Active transport also involves the participation of carrier proteins like facilitated diffusion. Now students, we all know that plants, they absorb mineral ions from the soil by their roots. And as the concentration of mineral ions, that is higher in the soil, therefore the mineral ions, they enter within the roots by the process of diffusion. Now a stage is reached when the concentration of mineral ions within the roots, it becomes higher as compared to the soil. Now what will happen? Do these mineral ions, they will start going back into the soil? No. Now the plant, it will use energy in the form of ATP to absorb the rest of the mineral ions which are present in the soil. So in this way, active transport of mineral ions will take place, and it will involve the participation of ATP, and all the mineral ions which are present in the soil, they will be absorbed by the roots. Now students, a very interesting example of this that is seen of magnesium ion absorption. Students, very often it is seen that the concentration of magnesium ions, that is much more within the root hair cell as compared to the soil. Despite this, the root hair cells, they keep on absorbing the magnesium ions. So this absorption of magnesium ion, that is taking place against the concentration gradient, that is from the area of its lower concentration to the area of its higher concentration. So when the movement of molecules, it take place against the concentration gradient, then it is known as active transport. And active transport, it is an energy consuming process because ATP is used for the absorption of materials against the concentration gradient. Now students, how the active transport works? We all know that active transport involves the participation of carrier proteins, and it also needs energy in the form of ATP. First, the carrier proteins, they will combine with the molecule or the substance which is to be transported within the cell. Once the carrier protein it binds with the substance, then on the inner side it will combine with the ATP and it get energized. When the carrier protein it gets energized, then it will undergo a conformational change, and in this way the transport of material it will take place within the cell. So what is happening in case of active transport? In case of active transport, first the carrier proteins it binds with the substance which is to be transported within the cell. Then the carrier protein it get energized with the help of ATP molecules, and once it get energized it will undergo a change in its shape, and in this way the transport of materials will take place within the cells. Now students, we all know that energy that is released by the process of respiration. So any factor which is affecting the process of respiration, that will ultimately affect the process of active transport. Like lack of oxygen, it affects the process of respiration. So it will also affect the process of active transport as well. There are certain poisons like cyanide which completely stops the process of respiration. So these poisons will ultimately stop the process of active transport as well. Now students, sodium-potassium exchange pump, it is a very good example of active transport, and sodium-potassium exchange pump that is present in almost all the cell membranes. And sodium-potassium exchange pump, this is responsible for high potassium ion concentration and low sodium ion concentration within the cells. The sodium-potassium exchange pump that is brought by the or it involves the participation of carrier proteins, and these carrier proteins are the sodium-potassium ATPase. Sodium-potassium ATPase carrier protein, it will need one molecule of ATP to pump out 3 sodium ions outside and to pump in 2 potassium ions inside. Now students, the movement of these ions like sodium ion and potassium ion, that is taking place against the concentration gradient. As the movement of ions that is taking place against the concentration gradient, therefore energy is involved in the form of ATP. So sodium-potassium exchange pump, it is a type of active transport in which energy is needed in the form of ATP, and it involves the participation of carrier proteins, and these carrier proteins, they are sodium-potassium ATPase. Sodium-potassium ATPase, it is using one molecule of ATP for pumping out 3 sodium ions outside and 2 potassium ions inside. Now students, the concentration of sodium ions is already higher outside, whereas the concentration of potassium ion, it is already higher inside. So the movement of sodium ions as well as potassium ions, that is taking place against the concentration gradient. So it is an example of active transport. So students, today we have studied in detail about the various types of transport like passive transport and active transport. Now what is passive transport? In passive transport, the movement of molecules that is taking place from higher to lower concentration, or we can say that the movement of molecules that is taking place down the concentration gradient. Whereas in case of active transport, the movement of molecules that is taking place from low concentration to higher concentration, that is against the concentration gradient. Now next difference, in case of passive transport, carrier proteins, they may be involved or they may not be involved, whereas in case of active transport, carrier proteins, they are always involved. Third difference students, in case of passive transport, no ATP is needed, whereas in case of active transport, ATP is needed because it is energizing the carrier proteins, and when these carrier proteins they get energized, they will undergo conformational changes, and in this way they are responsible for the transport of materials within or outside the cells. So students, this was all about passive and active transport. I hope you all must have understood it very well. So thank you to all.